Eliza Marsh knocked on the fourth door of the afternoon and received, for the fourth time, the same careful, apologetic refusal. The street had gone gray with the particular flat autumn light that made everything look considerably more tired than it might have looked under kinder sun, and Eliza had walked the whole length of it twice now, knocking at every house that showed a curtain drawn open and a chimney smoking, hoping each time that this particular door might prove different from the last. Her feet ached in a way that had stopped being a minor complaint somewhere around the second refusal, and had settled into something closer to a genuine misery she was too proud to mention aloud. Mrs. Sutcliffe, who ran the only proper boarding house in Cedar Bend, stood in her own doorway with her hands twisted into her apron, unable to quite meet Eliza's eyes. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Marsh," she said. "Truly I am. But a woman in your condition, without proper papers to show for her marriage, it isn't a respectable arrangement I can offer under my roof. You understand." Her voice carried the particular strain of a woman reciting words she had rehearsed since hearing the first whispered version of Eliza's situation the previous afternoon. Eliza did not entirely understand, though she had heard the same careful phrase, in one form or another, at 3 other doors that same afternoon. She was 7 months along, exhausted from a journey of nearly 200 miles, and the particular ache low in her back that had been building all day suggested her body cared considerably less for Cedar Bend's notions of respectability than the town itself did. "I have nowhere else to try," Eliza said plainly, resisting the particular urge to let her voice shake. "I've asked at every house on this street. I'm sorry, Mrs. Sutcliffe said again, and closed the door gently. The particular gentle closing of a woman who felt the wrongness of what she was doing and did it anyway. Eliza stood a long moment on the empty street, one hand pressed to the small of her back, understanding, with a cold clarity that made the autumn afternoon feel considerably colder, that she had no clear notion of where she would sleep that night. She considered, briefly and without much hope, whether the church might offer some temporary shelter, though she had already noticed the particular careful distance the Reverend's wife had kept during that morning's service, a distance that suggested Cordelia's whispered doubts had reached even that quarter of town. She thought, too, of simply walking back the way she had come, though the nearest proper town lay a full day's travel distant, well beyond what her tired body could reasonably manage before nightfall. It was Isaiah Prewitt who found her there, sitting on the low stone wall outside the Mercantile some 20 minutes later, her small traveling case beside her, and her face carefully composed against whatever she was actually feeling. Isaiah was Cedar Bend's carpenter, a quiet man of 34 who kept a modest workshop at the edge of town, and spoke, most days, only as much as his work strictly required. He had watched Eliza's afternoon of refused doors from a distance, the particular unhurried attention of a man who noticed things without commenting on them, until he had something useful to offer, and he crossed the street now with a length of rope still coiled over one shoulder from whatever job he'd been finishing. He had, in fact, watched from the workshop window as she'd been turned away from Mrs. Sutcliffe's door, and had set down his own tools without much deliberation once he understood the pattern of what he was witnessing, a woman being refused shelter by a town that ought to have known better than to let its own caution outweigh simple decency. He did not consider himself a particularly compassionate man by temperament, only a practical one, and the practical fact of a pregnant widow with nowhere to sleep struck him as a problem considerably more urgent than whatever caution had kept every other door in town closed against her. "You've nowhere to stay," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," Eliza admitted, too tired to dress the plain fact up in anything softer. Isaiah considered that a moment, the particular careful consideration of a man weighing a problem before speaking about it. "I've a workshop with a sound roof and a stove that draws well," he said. "Not proper lodging for a lady, I'll grant you, but it's dry and it's warm, and nobody in this town gets to tell me who I let sit by my own fire." He said it plainly, without any performance of gallantry, the particular unadorned offer of a man who had decided something needed doing and saw no reason to dress the decision up in flowery language it didn't require. Eliza studied his face a moment, looking for whatever hidden motive 6 days of closed doors had taught her to expect from strangers, and found, instead, only the plain, steady patience of a man who meant precisely what he'd said, and nothing more complicated besides. To understand how Eliza Marsh came to be sitting outside a Cedar Bend mercantile with nowhere to sleep, it helps to understand the 6 weeks that preceded that afternoon, and the particular chain of small misfortunes that had brought her, step by step, to that exact stone wall. Her husband, Thomas Marsh, had died in a logging accident 3 counties east that summer, a falling limb catching him wrong in a moment nobody could have predicted, and Eliza had found herself, within a month, a widow of 27 with a child coming and no family of her own left living to turn to. Thomas had spoken often of his older brother, Nathaniel, who had homesteaded near Cedar Bend some years back, and Eliza had decided in the raw grief of that first month that reaching Nathaniel's door was the only plan she had strength enough to make. Thomas and Eliza had married quietly 2 years before, in a small church near her own family's farm, and she had loved him plainly and completely for the whole of that short marriage, a gentle, hard-working man who had talked, more often as her pregnancy advanced, of the particular joy he expected fatherhood to bring him. His death had come so suddenly that Eliza had spent the first weeks of her grief simply disbelieving it, waking some mornings still expecting to hear his boots on the porch steps before the plain fact of his absence settled over her again. The journey west had cost her more than she'd budgeted for, in both money and health, and a difficult river crossing outside the last proper town had nearly cost her considerably more than that. The ferry had struck a submerged log hard enough to pitch half her belongings into the current, and among what the river took was the small document case holding her marriage certificate, the one piece of paper that might have spared her every door she'd knocked on since. She had arrived in Cedar Bend 3 days ago, found Nathaniel Marsh's homestead easily enough, and had been received at first with the plain kindness of a brother genuinely grieved by his sibling's death. Nathaniel had embraced her at the door, tears standing plainly in his eyes, and had spoken warmly that first evening of Thomas's childhood, of fishing trips and shared chores, the particular unguarded grief of a man remembering a brother he had not seen in several years before the news of his death reached him. It was Nathaniel's wife, Cordelia, who had turned that welcome cold within a single evening, asking pointed questions about papers Eliza could not produce, and suggesting, with the particular careful cruelty of a woman protecting land she had already begun quietly counting as her own children's inheritance, that a pregnant stranger without proof of marriage was exactly the kind of complication a respectable family ought to handle at arm's length, rather than under its own roof. Cordelia had 3 children of her own, all still young, and had made plain, in ways she never quite stated outright, that any legitimate claim Eliza's unborn child might carry to the Marsh family name represented a complication she had no intention of welcoming graciously. She had asked, that first evening, with the particular false gentleness of a woman testing a theory she already half believed, whether Eliza had brought any letters from Thomas, any keepsake that might confirm the marriage properly. And Eliza's honest admission that the river had taken her papers had settled, in Cordelia's expression, into something considerably harder than simple doubt. Cordelia had not said outright that she doubted the marriage. She had simply mentioned it, carefully, to enough people in town that Eliza's search for lodging had turned, within 2 days, into the particular gauntlet of closed doors she had just finished walking. Isaiah's workshop was plain and orderly, sawdust swept into careful piles, tools hung in a pattern that suggested a man who valued knowing exactly where everything belonged. He cleared a corner near the stove, brought over a cot he kept for occasional late work nights, and set a kettle to boil without much further conversation, the particular unhurried hospitality of a man who did not need words to make a stranger feel less alone. Eliza sat that first evening watching the stove's small fire and the careful geometry of half-finished furniture around her, chairs and a modest cabinet, and what looked to be the beginnings of a child's cradle, and felt, for the first time in weeks, something loosen slightly in her chest that had been held tight since Thomas's death. The workshop smelled of cedar shavings and lamp oil, an honest, uncomplicated smell that reminded her, distantly, of her own father's tool shed from childhood. "I'll not have you think this is charity," Eliza said that first evening, watching him work at his bench by lamplight. "I can mend, and I can cook plain food, and I'll not sit idle eating a stranger's bread for nothing in return." "Didn't imagine you would," Isaiah said, not looking up from the chair leg he was shaping. "There's mending in that basket by the door that's wanted doing for a month. Start there, if idleness troubles you." She started there that very evening, finding the basket exactly where he'd said, work shirts and a torn coat lining that wanted only a careful hand, and set to it by the stove's warm light while Isaiah continued his own work nearby, the two of them settling into a companionable quiet. Neither felt any particular need to fill with conversation. The arrangement settled, over the following days, into something considerably more comfortable than she had any right to expect from a stranger's workshop floor. Word of the arrangement traveled through Cedar Bend, the way such things traveled through any small town, and Cordelia Marsh, hearing that the widow had found lodging with the carpenter, rather than simply moving on, took to mentioning, at the mercantile and the church social alike, her private opinion that a woman of uncertain marriage sharing close quarters with an unmarried man hardly improved the propriety of her situation. The remarks found willing ears among a certain portion of Cedar Bend's more cautious residents, the particular kind of quiet judgment that never quite announced itself as unkindness, but nonetheless left Eliza feeling watched every time she walked to the mercantile for thread or flour. She noticed the sideways glances, the conversations that quieted slightly when she entered a room, and bore them with the particular composed dignity of a woman who had already survived considerably worse than small-town disapproval. Isaiah heard the remarks second-hand, the way most things reached him, and addressed them the only way he knew how, plainly and without much patience for indirect cruelty. "Man built me a chair last spring that I've sat in every evening since," he told Otis Fell, the mercantile owner, when the older man mentioned the gossip carefully. "Reckon a woman mending my shirts in the next room over troubles this town's notion of propriety a good deal less than it troubles Cordelia Marsh's notion of who deserves her husband's land." Otis, who had known Isaiah the better part of a decade and trusted his judgment on most matters beyond simple carpentry, repeated the remark to enough people that it traveled back to Cordelia within the day and did nothing to soften her opinion, though it did, Eliza noticed, quiet several of the town's more casual gossips considerably. It was the second week that Isaiah began, without much announcement, clearing a section of ground behind his workshop, and Eliza watched him mark out a modest rectangle with stakes and string one bright afternoon without understanding what he intended. She had noticed, over those first 2 weeks, a particular pattern to his days: dawn work in the main workshop on whatever paying commissions the town required of him, and then, some afternoons, a quiet withdrawal to this cleared patch of ground behind the building where he measured and marked, without explaining himself. She had assumed at first some private project of his own, an expansion to his workshop perhaps, and had not thought to ask directly until the stakes and string made the rectangle's modest dimensions plain enough to guess at. "You're planning to build something," she observed. "Small room," Isaiah said. "One good window, a proper stove, a door that closes tight against winter. Won't be finished before the baby comes, most likely, but it'll be finished before the worst of the cold sets in. For me," Eliza said, understanding slowly. "For whoever needs a sound roof and nobody troubling them about the terms of it," Isaiah said, which was, she was learning, as close as he generally came to saying something plainly sentimental. She helped where her condition allowed, holding boards steady while he cut them, sanding rough edges smooth, and found, in the particular satisfaction of watching a structure rise plank by careful plank, something that felt considerably like healing after weeks of exhausted grief. Isaiah worked with an unhurried thoroughness that reminded her, in its quiet way, of Thomas's own careful habits, though she noticed, too, that Isaiah brought something to the work that felt entirely his own, a patience that seemed to come from some place deeper than simple craftsmanship. Some afternoons, when her back ached too much for standing work, she simply sat nearby on an overturned crate and watched, offering small observations about the framing or the window placement that Isaiah, to her surprise, generally took seriously rather than dismissing as a woman's uninformed opinion. He explained, when she asked, the reasoning behind each decision, why the window faced south rather than east, why the stove sat where it did relative to the door, And Eliza found herself learning, almost without noticing, the particular satisfaction of understanding exactly how a home came together board by considered board. "You lost someone too," she said one evening, watching him plane a length of pine smoothed by lamplight. "I hear it in how careful you are with things." Isaiah did not answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that Eliza wondered whether she had overstepped some boundary he preferred left untouched. "My wife," he said finally. 6 years back, the birth went wrong, and she didn't survive it, and the child didn't either." He set down the plane. "Built her coffin myself. Seemed wrong to let another man's hands do that particular work." "I'm sorry," Eliza said quietly. "Long while ago now," Isaiah said, though something in his voice suggested the particular ache had not fully faded despite the years. "Learned since then that building things properly is about the only comfort I've ever managed to trust completely. Wood does what you ask of it, if you're patient and honest with your measurements. People and grief, considerably less predictable." He was quiet a moment longer, turning the plane over in his hands. "Her name was Sarah," he added, offering the detail without being asked. The particular small generosity of a man deciding, in that moment, that Eliza had earned a fuller picture than his usual careful silence generally allowed anyone. "She'd have liked you, I think. Had the same particular way of refusing help she hadn't properly earned." Eliza found herself, in the days that followed, thinking of that small, unprompted detail more often than she examined too closely. Understanding that a man so evidently sparing with his own history had offered her something considerably more valuable than simple politeness required. The small room rose steadily through the following weeks, walls framed and raised, the roof shingled tight against the coming rains, and Isaiah left the door for last, working on it some evenings after Eliza had already gone to rest, planing and fitting the panels with a care that suggested the door mattered to him beyond its simple practical function. She woke, more than one night, to the faint sound of his careful work continuing well past when the rest of the workshop had gone quiet, and understood, without needing to ask, that the door was receiving an attention the walls and roof, however solid, had not quite required of him in the same way. He carved, into the door's upper panel, a small design she did not fully understand until he explained it. A simple sun rising over a straight horizon line. The particular symbol, he said, that Oregon homesteaders sometimes carved into a threshold to mark a home properly begun, rather than simply built. "My father carved one like it into our own farmhouse door, back before I was old enough to properly remember him doing it," Isaiah said, running his thumb along the carved lines with the particular reverence of a man handling something considerably more meaningful than simple decoration. "Told me once that a door ought to promise something true to whoever walks through it, not just keep the weather out." "Every home needs one true door," Isaiah said, fitting the hinges with careful precision. "Everything else can shift and settle and need mending over the years. The door ought to be the one thing that closes true from the very first day." Eliza's time came 3 weeks earlier than the midwife had predicted, on a cold evening when the small room's stove had only just been properly tested against the season's first hard frost. Mrs. Bell, the town's midwife, came quickly once summoned, though the labor proved difficult enough that Isaiah spent the better part of that long night pacing the workshop's outer room. Splitting kindling he did not strictly need split simply to keep his hands occupied against the particular helpless fear of a man who had once before waded through a night like this one with a considerably worse outcome. He did not sleep, nor did he sit still for more than a few minutes at a stretch, finding small practical tasks to occupy his hands through the long hours, stoking the stove, checking the door's hinges though he had checked them thoroughly only days before, anything to keep his mind from settling too fully on the memory of another difficult night 6 years past. Mrs. Bell, passing through the workshop once for fresh water, noted his pallor and told him plainly, with the particular brisk kindness of a woman who had delivered a great many babies and buried rather fewer mothers than town gossip generally suggested, that Eliza was strong, and the labor, while difficult, was not yet cause for the particular fear plainly written across his face. The baby came near dawn, small and furious and entirely healthy, a daughter Eliza named Grace before she had properly caught her breath from the delivery itself. Mrs. Belle brought Isaiah in once mother and child were settled, and he stood in the doorway of the small room he had built with his own hands, looking at the two of them with an expression he did not trouble to fully control. "She's sound," Mrs. Bell told him. "Both of them are sound." Isaiah nodded and said nothing for a long moment, and Eliza watched something in his shoulders ease that had been held tight since the labor first began. Word of the difficult night traveled through Cedar Bend the way such things did, and it reached Nathaniel Marsh before the day was fully out, prompting him to ride over himself that same afternoon, considerably more troubled than his wife had ever managed to make him about the whole uncertain arrangement. He arrived at the workshop still dressed in his work clothes, having left his own chores unfinished the moment word reached him, and Isaiah met him at the door with the particular guarded caution of a man uncertain whether this visit brought further trouble or something else entirely. He found Eliza sitting up in the small room with Grace against her chest, and stood in the doorway a long moment, taking in the sound structure his brother's widow had been given shelter within, before speaking. "Cordelia's been telling half the town you weren't rightly married to Thomas," he said plainly. "I should have asked you outright weeks ago instead of letting her doubt stand unanswered." "I lost the papers in a river crossing," Eliza said. "I've no way to prove it beyond my own word." Nathaniel was quiet a moment, his gaze moving from Eliza to the sleeping infant in her arms, and something in his expression suggested a man working through a considerable weight of belated guilt. "Thomas wrote me a letter, the month before he died," Nathaniel said slowly. "Mentioned his wife plainly, mentioned a child coming. I'd forgotten it entirely until this morning, going through his old letters trying to decide what to tell my own conscience." He drew a folded paper from his coat, found it again last night, should have thought to look considerably sooner. He read a portion of it aloud, Thomas's own familiar hand describing plans for the coming child, warm mentions of Eliza's cooking and her steady temperament, small, ordinary details that could only have come from a genuinely happy marriage, and Eliza found herself crying quietly at the sound of her husband's voice rendered plain on paper after weeks of carrying his memory largely alone. The letter, read plainly before witnesses that same week, settled the matter of Eliza's marriage considerably more thoroughly than any single document might have managed alone. Thomas's own careful handwriting confirming what Isaiah had already decided, weeks before, mattered rather less to him than the plain evidence of Eliza's character. Cordelia's opinion softened not from any particular grace on her own part, but from the plain, undeniable fact of a brother's letter and a whole town's growing fondness for a woman who had proven, through weeks of quiet, honest labor, considerably more worth trusting than idle gossip had ever suggested. She called on Eliza once that spring, stiff and formal, bringing a small quilt for Grace that Eliza suspected had cost her considerable private struggle to offer, and Eliza accepted it graciously, understanding that some amends arrived awkwardly and were worth accepting regardless. Mrs. Sutcliffe, too, stopped by the workshop that spring, admitting with visible discomfort that she had turned away a woman in genuine need out of a caution she had come to regret considerably. Eliza forgave her plainly, understanding that fear of scandal, however misguided, was a different thing entirely from genuine cruelty, and the two women found themselves, in time, on considerably friendlier terms than that first refused afternoon had ever suggested possible. Eliza remained in the small room through that winter and the following spring, paying her way in mended clothes and careful cooking until she found steady work of her own taking in sewing for half the town, and Isaiah found reasons, most evenings, to linger past his own supper simply to hear Grace's small sounds through the thin wall between his workshop and the room he had built. The winter proved hard in the ordinary way Cedar Bend winters generally proved hard, deep snow and short days, and Isaiah took to clearing the short path between his workshop and the small room each morning before Eliza woke, a task she noticed and appreciated without either of them making particular mention of it. He built, too, a small cradle to match the room itself, carved with the same careful attention he had given the door, and Grace slept in it through that whole first winter, growing plump and curious in the particular way infants grow when properly and steadily cared for. "You never did ask anything in return for all this," Eliza said one evening, watching him fix a loose shutter that had rattled all through the recent storm. Not rent, not obligation, nothing beyond honest work traded honestly. Wasn't building it to be owed anything, Isaiah said. Built it because a woman and a child needed a door that closed properly against the cold, and I had two capable hands and the time to see it done right. And now? Eliza asked. Isaiah set down his tools and looked at her steadily, the particular direct look she had come to recognize as him choosing his words with unusual care. Now I find I've gotten considerably more used to Grace's small sounds through that wall than I ever expected to want again, he said. And I find I'd like to ask, properly this time, whether you'd consider a door with only one name carved above it, instead of two separate roofs standing close together. Eliza looked at the small, sturdy room he had built plank by careful plank through a hard season, at the carved sun rising over its true threshold, and thought of every door that had closed against her that first exhausted afternoon, and of the one door that had opened instead, quietly and without conditions. She thought, too, of Sarah, the wife whose memory Isaiah had carried so carefully for 6 years, and understood that whatever he was offering now came not from forgetting that loss, but from finally trusting himself to build something new alongside it. I'd consider it, she said, provided you understand plainly that I'll expect the same honest partnership in this as I've had in everything else you've built. Wouldn't want it any other way, Isaiah said, and meant it entirely. They married that spring, joining the small room to Isaiah's own house, with a single connecting doorway he built himself, the same careful sun carved above it that marked the first door he had ever made her, and Cedar Bend, having watched the whole quiet story unfold with the particular patient interest small towns eventually bring to stories they've decided deserve a good ending, welcomed Grace's small family with a warmth the town's earlier closed doors had never once suggested it was capable of offering. The ceremony itself was small, held in Isaiah's workshop among the half-finished furniture and the particular honest smell of cedar shavings that had come to mean home to Eliza more thoroughly than any grander building might have managed. Nathaniel stood witness, and even Cordelia attended, stiff but present, holding Grace briefly during the small reception afterward, with an awkward tenderness that suggested her earlier coldness had genuinely softened rather than merely faded from convenience. Mrs. Bell attended too, remarking to anyone who'd listen that she'd delivered a great many babies in Cedar Bend over the years, but had rarely seen a father, by marriage or otherwise, quite so thoroughly devoted from the very first difficult night onward. Otis Fell brought a small gift of good nails and hinges, the particular practical humor of a man who understood exactly what kind of household he was celebrating, and Isaiah accepted the gift with the first full, unguarded laugh Eliza had heard from him in all the months she'd known him. Some homes, it turned out, needed nothing grander than one patient man's willingness to build, plank by honest plank, exactly what a turned-away woman and her child actually required, and a door that closed true from the very first cold night it was asked to hold against the winter.